Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling something I think we all experience, and that's waiting. You ever feel like you're kind of in a holding pattern, just waiting for something to happen? Well, get ready to see waiting in a whole new light, because we are going deep into this Christian reflection that really flips the script on how we view these periods of pause, these periods of waiting, reframing them as times of incredible growth.
Yeah. It is fascinating. It's fascinating how we often see waiting as this negative space,
Yeah.
kind of this purgatory before the good stuff arrives.
Right.
But this reflection really, really encourages us to see waiting not as a standstill, but as an active process of transformation.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about, twiddling your thumbs and hoping something changes, but recognizing this time is actually brimming with potential. So that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We'll explore how being grateful for even those seemingly small things can radically shift your perspective, how actually actively waiting on God can build strength. And we'll even tackle how those frustrating setbacks, I mean, we all have them,
Right.
how those can actually be the stepping stones you need to move forward.
Yeah. And what's really intriguing is that this reflection starts by, really emphasizing the power of gratitude. Instead of getting kind of bogged down in what you lack, it encourages you to focus on the abundance that's already present in your life. Shift your focus from what's missing to what's there.
Oh, I love that. It's like choosing to see the glass half full, even when everything around you feels a bit empty.
Absolutely.
And they use a really powerful example in this reflection. They talk about how before multiplying the loaves and fishes, Jesus first gave thanks for what was already there.
That is such a subtle but profound point, isn't it?
It is.
Instead of, bemoaning the lack of food for the crowd, Jesus acknowledged that small amount they did have. It's as if acknowledging even the smallest blessings can open the door for greater things to happen.
Yeah. It's like that feeling when you unexpectedly find a $5 bill in your pocket, you know? Suddenly the day feels a bit brighter.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, what's one small blessing, maybe something seemingly insignificant that you've experienced today?
hmm
How does even just acknowledging that small good thing shift your perspective a little?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught in that mental trap of, I'll be happy when.
Oh, yeah.
But gratitude invites us to find joy in the here and now,
Yeah.
in the midst of the waiting.
Absolutely. But, let's be real. It's not always easy to maintain that positive outlook, especially when things are tough.
Right.
And this reflection tackles this head on.
Yeah.
It really stresses the importance of maintaining hope, even when things feel uncertain,
Right.
because God sees the bigger picture.
It's like being engrossed in a gripping novel.
Yeah.
Not every chapter is going to be, a climactic showdown. Some chapters are slower, They're building that tension. They're setting the stage for what's to come. But all of those chapters, even those quiet ones, are essential to the story.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. And it actually reminds me of the biblical story of David. He was anointed king long before he actually stepped into the role.
Wow.
Think about that. Years of waiting, facing dangers, uncertainty, even betrayal.
Yeah.
Yet he used those years to grow, to learn, to become the leader he was meant to be.
David's story is such a powerful reminder that the waiting period is rarely wasted time.
Yeah.
It's a time for preparation, for, refining your skills, for deepening your character.
So let me ask you this. Think about a time in your life when you felt uncertain, maybe even a little lost about what the future held. How could you apply this perspective, this idea of trusting the process, to that situation? How could you reframe those uncertain moments as opportunities for growth and preparation?
Hmm. This brings us to another critical element that this reflection highlights, and that is this idea of actively waiting, which they link directly to the power of prayer.
Right. And it pushes back on the idea that patience means passively enduring something.
Yeah.
It's not about gritting your teeth and bearing it. It's about actively engaging with God during the process.
Yeah, and prayer becomes this incredible tool for connecting with God, for expressing, your anxieties and your fears, and also reminding yourself that He is at work even when you can't see the results.
Oh, I love that. It's like even when we feel alone in the waiting, prayer is this direct line to God,
Absolutely.
this constant reminder that we're not in it alone.
Yeah.
And they bring in this beautiful image of prayer being this pathway to God's heart.
Yeah.
And they reference that verse from Romans, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer.
It's a powerful reminder that even when you're feeling overwhelmed or discouraged, prayer can ground you, connect you to something much bigger than yourself. It's like tapping into an inexhaustible source of strength.
Yeah, it makes me think about that quote, prayer doesn't change God, it changes me.
Hmm.
So maybe a key takeaway for all of us is to carve out even just a few minutes each day to intentionally connect with God through prayer.
Yeah, it's about creating that space for stillness, for listening, for remembering that even in those seasons of waiting, you're not alone.
And the reflection takes this concept of waiting even further,
Yeah.
reframing it as a powerful time for growth. It's not just about enduring the wait, it's about maximizing it.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. This reflection challenges you to kind of shift your mindset from why is this taking so long
Hmm.
to what is God teaching me during this time?
It's like that saying, the only constant is change. So instead of resisting the waiting period, what if we embraced it as a chance to become better, stronger versions of ourselves?
Yeah, they use the analogy of a plant.
Oh, okay.
Before it blooms, it needs time to develop a strong root system. It's the same with us,
Right.
While we're waiting, God is often strengthening our spiritual roots, preparing us for whatever's coming next.
It's that idea of iron sharpens iron,
Yeah.
but on a spiritual level.
Mm.
And it reminds me of the story of Joseph from the Bible. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned.
Wow.
Talk about a waiting period filled with hardship.
Right.
But
Yeah.
his story, I mean,
Yeah, Joseph's story is incredible.
like incredible. It would have been so easy to become bitter and resentful.
Oh, absolutely.
But instead, each hardship shaped him, prepared him for his ultimate destiny.
Right.
He rose to a position of power, was able to save his family from famine. It's like all those years of waiting weren't just some random, cruel twist of fate.
Right.
They were part of a bigger plan that he couldn't see at the time.
Exactly. It's like a mosaic.
Oh, yeah.
Up close, the individual pieces might seem random, even chaotic, but you step back and you see the beauty of the whole picture.
So as you think about your own life, maybe the situation you're waiting on right now, I want you to ask yourself, what is God teaching me through this?
Yeah.
Is there a new skill you could be learning, a perspective you could be developing?
Yeah.
What spiritual roots is God strengthening in you during this time?
That's a powerful question. And it leads us to another critical point that this reflection makes, the idea of learning from failures.
Oh, okay.
And they bring in the story of Thomas Edison, who, famously said something like, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work.
Oh, I love that quote. It's such a testament to resilience, to that never give up
Yeah.
attitude.
Yeah.
And they connect this to the idea of faith continuing to believe even when things don't go as planned.
Right.
Because sometimes those setbacks are actually setups for something even greater.
It's about having the faith that there is a solution, even when you can't see it yet.
Right.
And that each, quote unquote failure is actually a valuable lesson in disguise.
So think about a recent challenge you faced. Maybe a project that didn't go as planned, a goal you didn't reach. What if, instead of seeing it as a failure, you viewed it through the lens of Thomas Edison? What did you learn from that experience? How did it equip you for the next step in your journey?
What's fascinating is how this reflection connects Edison's persistence to something we often see in those who have achieved incredible things, a willingness to embrace challenges as opportunities for growth.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the extraordinary story of Nelson Mandela.
Oh, Mandela.
Yeah.
Talk about patience and perseverance. I mean, this guy endured 27 years in prison for his beliefs, yet he emerged with this incredible spirit of reconciliation.
Wow.
It makes you wonder what was happening inside of him during those long years of confinement.
That's precisely what's so striking about Mandela. He didn't just passively endure his imprisonment. He actively used that time, He reflected, he learned, he deepened his understanding of himself and the world. He was preparing for that leadership role that he would ultimately play in transforming his nation.
And the reflection highlights how Mandela's choice to choose reconciliation over revenge when he was released speaks volumes about his spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
He understood that true strength isn't found in bitterness, but in wisdom,
Right.
in choosing to build rather than destroy.
It's a powerful example of how even in the face of suffering, we have a choice in how we respond.
Yeah.
We can choose growth. We can choose forgiveness, We can choose to become better, not bitter.
So think about a challenge you're facing right now, whether it's big or small.
Yeah.
How could you apply Mandela's approach to that situation?
Hmm.
What would it look like to choose patience, perseverance, and ultimately forgiveness?
Right.
What if, even in the midst of difficulty, there's an opportunity for transformation? I
Wow.
mean, it really changes your whole perspective.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. It does. It is. It's encouraging to think that those seemingly empty spaces, those times of waiting, are actually brimming with God's unseen work.
It's like he's working behind the scenes on something incredible.
He is. He is. And it's just mind-blowing to think that he's got this perfect plan for our lives, a
Mhm.
plan that will ultimately lead to our good and his glory.
You know, it's not always easy to see that when you're in the thick of it, but these stories, these examples, they really remind us that God is always at work, even when we can't see it.
He is. He is always at work.
So what's one specific thing that stood out to you from this reflection? Like something that you're going to take away and try to apply to your own life this week?
One thing that really resonated with me is this idea that the waiting period isn't some arbitrary test.
Right.
It's actually a crucible for forging our character, our faith, our very destiny.
It's like those trials and tribulations, they're not meant to break us. They're meant to refine us.
Absolutely.
Like gold is purified in the fire.
Yeah.
So those times of waiting, they're actually opportunities to become stronger, more resilient, more like Christ. And I think that's incredibly encouraging.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's take a moment to reflect on these incredible examples of patience, faith, and perseverance.
Yeah.
You know, how can we apply these lessons to our own lives, to those areas where we're feeling stuck, impatient, or discouraged?
Right. How can we actually take these profound truths and put them into practice?
Exactly. And, what would it look like to embrace those waiting periods as times for growth,
Yeah.
for deepening our relationship with God, and for preparing for the amazing things he has in store?
I think that's the key, isn't it? It's shifting our perspective from why me to what now.
Hmm.
Instead of focusing on what we're missing, we can choose to focus on what God is doing in us right now.
Exactly. And I think that shift in perspective, it can be so powerful. It takes you from being a passive bystander to an active participant in the process.
Absolutely, and empowers us to partner with God in our own transformation.
And it reminds us that even though the waiting might feel long, even though it might be difficult, God is faithful. He is working all things together for our good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let's choose to trust his process, even when we don't understand it.
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? To surrender our own timelines and agendas and embrace God's perfect timing.
Right. And sometimes that surrender is the hardest part. But, I think it's in that surrender that we find true freedom, true peace.
Absolutely. It's in letting go of our own control that we open ourselves up to God's incredible plan for our lives.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to delve even deeper into this whole idea of trusting God's timing.
Looking forward to it.
So stay with us. It's amazing how much we can learn from those who've kind of walked the path of waiting before us. Their stories, not just ancient history, they're like these roadmaps for navigating those seasons when we feel stuck.
And speaking of roadmaps, the reflection we're deep diving into today highlights some powerful biblical examples that really illuminate this whole idea of trusting God's process.
Right. They specifically focus on Abraham, Moses, and David. I mean, these figures who faced, immense challenges and lengthy waiting periods, but ultimately witnessed the fulfillment of God's promises in incredible ways.
Yeah, it's easy to read these stories as simple Sunday school lessons, but when you really dig into them, they reveal profound insights into how God uses waiting to refine us, strengthen our faith, and ultimately prepare us for those incredible things he has planned.
Okay, so let's start with Abraham. His story is like the ultimate example of trusting God's promises, even when they seem utterly impossible.
Yeah. Remember, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation, but there was one major catch. He and his wife, Sarah, were well past childbearing age.
Right.
Well past it.
Imagine being Abraham. You're promised, nationhood, descendants, as numerous as the stars, but you're looking at your aging body, your wife facing the same limitations, and it seems like a cruel joke.
Right.
What kind of faith does it take to not just intellectually assent to that promise, but to actually order your life as if it's already a reality?
Right. It's not just about believing in God's power. It's about living as if that power is already at work in your life, even when all evidence points to the contrary.
And the reflection emphasizes that Abraham waited decades for this promise to be fulfilled. Decades. It wasn't some overnight miracle.
Right.
It was a journey of constantly renewing his trust, persevering through doubt, and clinging to hope, even when circumstances seemed to mock that hope.
That's what's so powerful about Abraham's story. It wasn't passive waiting. It was an active wrestling with God. A constant surrender to a plan that seemed illogical, even absurd from a human perspective.
Yeah. And here's the key. Those decades of waiting weren't empty or wasted. They were filled with God shaping Abraham's character, stretching his faith, preparing him to become not just a father, but the father of a multitude, a spiritual lineage that extends through history.
It's as if God was using that time to create space within Abraham for the enormity of the blessing that was coming. The waiting period was part of the blessing itself.
Okay, so let's shift to Moses. Talk about waiting. This guy spent 40 years in the desert before God called him to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt.
I know. It's easy to look at those wilderness years and think, what a waste. Couldn't God have gotten to the point a little quicker?
Right.
But, when you see those years through the lens of this reflection, you realize they were actually crucial in shaping Moses into the leader he needed to be.
He went from being a prince in Pharaoh's court to being a humble shepherd, tending flocks in the middle of nowhere. Talk about a change of pace. But in those quiet, ordinary years, he was learning humility, developing a deeper understanding of God's character, and coming to rely fully on God's provision.
Yeah, leading a nation out of slavery is no walk in the park. It requires immense strength, wisdom, and compassion.
For sure.
And it seems those are the very qualities that Moses developed during his time in the wilderness.
It's like those years were a masterclass in leadership disguised as exile. And it makes you wonder what seemingly unimportant experiences in your own life might actually be crucial training ground for what God has called you to do.
What often feels like a detour might be the most direct route to where you need to be.
And then we have David, the shepherd boy who became a mighty king.
Yeah.
But his path to the throne was anything but a straightforward coronation. I mean, he was anointed as king while still young, but then he had to wait years. I mean, facing constant danger, betrayal, uncertainty before he actually assumed the role.
Think about the psychological and emotional toll of that. Knowing you're destined for greatness, but having to wait while facing one challenge after another.
I mean, it would have been easy to lose heart, to give in to despair, but David used that waiting time incredibly well.
Yeah. He honed his leadership abilities as a shepherd. He learned to fight as a warrior, and he poured out his heart to God in those incredibly raw and honest songs of, worship and lament.
Right.
He didn't just wait, he grew.
It's fascinating how all three of these biblical figures, Abraham, Moses, David, they didn't just passively sit around hoping things would change. They actively sought God. They leaned into the challenges and allowed those experiences to shape them.
Yeah, it's as if they understood that the waiting period wasn't some arbitrary test, but a crucible for forging their character, their faith, their very destinies.
And that brings us back to that critical question we explored earlier. What is God doing in you during your own season of waiting? What skills is he developing? What lessons is he teaching? What character qualities is he refining?
Yeah. It's so easy to get, trapped in that mental loop of why isn't this happening yet? But what if we shifted our focus to what is God doing in me right now?
Right.
How is he preparing me? What am I becoming?
That shift in perspective can be so powerful.
It is.
It takes you from being a passive bystander to an active participant in the process.
And it brings us back to this idea of trusting God's timing. We might not understand why things are taking so long, why we're facing certain obstacles, but we can trust that God sees the bigger picture.
Yeah, and he has a perfect plan for our lives.
Absolutely.
A plan that will ultimately lead to our good and his glory. It's not always easy to see that, when you're in the thick of it, but these stories remind us that God is always at work, even when we can't see it.
He is always at work. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's take a moment to reflect on these incredible examples of patience, of faith, and of perseverance.
Wow.
How can we apply these lessons to our own lives, to those areas where we're feeling stuck, impatient, or discouraged?
What would it look like to embrace those waiting periods as times for growth, for deepening our relationship with God, and for preparing for the amazing things he has in store?
All right, so we've explored the power of gratitude, prayer, these incredible examples of people who patiently waited on God. Now let's talk about, how to actually live this out. How do we practically trust God's timing in those moments when waiting feels less like a season of preparation and more like, well, just a lot of waiting.
Right, yeah, it's one thing to grasp these concepts in theory.
Right.
But, when you're in the thick of it,
Yeah.
when the doubts creep in, the frustration mounts, that's
Right.
when it gets real. Exactly. And this reflection doesn't shy away from that. It acknowledges that waiting isn't always easy. It can be downright discouraging, even painful at times, but it offers some really helpful strategies for navigating those tough moments.
Yeah, and a core strategy is shifting our mindset from passive waiting to active preparation. You know, it's about understanding that surrender isn't about sitting back and doing nothing. It's about actively seeking God's guidance, tuning into his voice, and making space for him to work in our hearts.
So it's like instead of asking, how long, God, we're asking, what are you doing in me during this time, God? What am I supposed to be learning?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And those active steps can take many forms, you know?
Yeah.
It might involve diving deeper into prayer, really wrestling with what God is saying through scripture, or maybe it's seeking wise counsel from mentors, pastors, people who've walked this road before.
And it doesn't always have to be super spiritual, right?
Right.
I mean, it could be using this time to develop a skill you've been putting off, finally tackling that creative project you've been dreaming about.
Right. It's about taking inventory. What gifts, talents, or resources have you been neglecting? What could you be nurturing during the season that might even play a role in what God has planned down the road?
It's like taking that energy you'd normally spend on worrying or complaining and channeling it into something productive, something life-giving.
Yeah. Remember those biblical examples we talked about? Abraham, Moses, David. I mean, they didn't just sit around bemoaning their circumstances. They actively sought God, honed their skills, and allowed those experiences to shape them into the leaders they were meant to be.
Okay, so let's get practical. If someone listening right now is feeling stuck in a waiting period, what's one concrete step they can take today to shift from passive waiting to active preparation?
Well, first things first, prayer. You know, it's the most direct line to God we have. What if you commit to carving out even 5 minutes each day to just pour out your heart to God? Express your anxieties, your frustrations, but also ask for his wisdom, you know? Say, God, what are you trying to teach me here? How can I be using this time well?
Oh, I love that. It's like we're taking our cue from Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was facing, the most agonizing experience imaginable.
Right.
And he prayed, not my will, but yours be done.
Yeah.
It's that posture of surrender, but also of seeking guidance.
And alongside prayer, reading scripture, even just a small passage each day can be incredibly grounding. The Bible is filled with stories of people who waited on God, who saw his faithfulness in incredible ways. Reading those stories can be like fuel for your own journey.
And here's something I found helpful, keeping a journal. Each day, jot down even one small thing you're grateful for, one way you see God working, even if it's subtle. It's like creating a tangible record of God's faithfulness, something you could look back on when those doubts start to surface.
That's such a great idea. It's so easy to forget the small victories when you're focused on the big picture. And those small victories, those little glimpses of God's goodness, can be like stepping stones across a river.
And beyond the spiritual disciplines, remember what we said about using this time productively. Maybe it's finally signing up for that online course you've been eyeing, dusting off your guitar, or tackling that pile of books you've been meaning to read.
It's amazing how even a small step towards something you're passionate about can re-energize you. It just shifts your focus from what you're waiting for to what you can be doing right now.
And who knows, maybe those skills you develop during this time, those insights you gain, will be the very things that equip you for what God has planned down the road.
Yeah, it's like the pieces of a puzzle coming together. We might not always understand how they fit in the moment, but looking back, we see that each piece, even the ones that felt out of place, contributed to the beauty of the whole picture.
And that brings us to a final, really provocative thought from this reflection. It asks, what if the things you're waiting for aren't actually delayed, but being divinely prepared for a specific moment and purpose?
Wow, that's a game changer, isn't it? It takes the whole concept of waiting and flips it on its head. It suggests that those seemingly empty spaces are actually brimming with God's unseen work.
It makes me think of that verse. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So maybe those dreams you're holding on to, those things you're longing for, aren't on hold. Maybe they're being carefully crafted by a God who knows the perfect time, the perfect way to bring them to pass.
It's like God is an artist and we are the canvas. He's working on a masterpiece. And sometimes that requires layers, textures, even those seemingly random brushstrokes that don't make sense until the whole picture is revealed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's hold on to that thought. What if the waiting isn't a punishment, but a privilege? What if it's not about God withholding something from us, but about Him preparing something incredible for us?
And in the meantime, let's choose to trust his process. Let's embrace those waiting periods as opportunities for growth, for deepening our relationship with God, and for preparing for the amazing things he has in store.
Yeah, it's not always easy, but it's always worth it.
Absolutely.
So keep seeking, keep growing, keep trusting. The best is yet to come.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's encouraged you to see waiting in a new light and to find hope even in the midst of uncertainty.
And remember, you're not alone in this journey. Until next time, keep diving deep.